And now we move to a discussion of the G20, the latest gathering of the G20 nations, which was held in Indonesia. What came out of the G20? What were some of the issues leading up to it? Who was there? Who wasn't there? Why weren't they there? What will this G20 meeting, what impact will it have on the world at large? Let's dive in. To discuss this, I want to bring on our special guest, Dr. Guy Burton, who is an adjunct professor of international affairs at the Brussels School of Governance. Dr. Burton, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
Thank you. Fine. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yes, absolutely. So, Dr. Burton, let's start with a relatively simplistic question, but many people may not know this. What is the G20? Can you tell us a bit about its history, its membership, its purpose?
Sure. So the G20 is a group of 20 countries that get together primarily to talk about economic and financial issues. It was formed in 1999, just after the financial crisis, which happened in 1998, in the wake of Russia and Asia. And that was an opportunity to bring those countries together. But it really got major purchase, after 2009, the great financial crisis that happened, in the wake of the Lehman Brothers collapse of 2008. And at that point, from 2009, you started to have very regular, annual meetings between the heads of governments. And those have been going on every year. So the focus is very much about economic and financial issues, and the 20 countries that make it up, do constitute quite a sizable proportion of the world. They make up about 65% of the global population, as well as over 80% of global GDP. So these countries matter.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, Dr. Burton, then, so tell us, what were some of the issues of concern leading into this G20? Global issues, economic issues, financial issues. What were some of the things that people were expecting the G20 to address or be impacted by leading into this meeting?
Sure. So it's primarily an economic talk shop, sort of talking about trying to coordinate or at least, find ways that the global economy can be maintained. Now, of course, there are wider issues going on. This year we've had Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has created problems when it came to sort of energy supplies as well as food supplies, which have seen sort of the price of those commodities go up. So we've seen rising cost of living as a result. So that alongside the recovery from the post-pandemic period, these have all been things that have sort of filtered in. Plus, of course, this summit was taking place at the same time as COP27, so the climate change summit that's taking place in Egypt.
Absolutely. So tell us a bit about who was there and who wasn't there at this G20 and why.
Yeah. So as I said, you have mostly all of the heads of government coming from those countries. However, there were two notable exceptions. Jair Bolsonaro, the outgoing president from Brazil, but perhaps more notably, Vladimir Putin from Russia. He wasn't present. At some point early on in the week, his foreign minister Sergei Lavrov was around, but he left before the final declaration was made.
So, why is that? I mean, is it, at the end of the day, regardless of what's happening in Ukraine, he is a member of the G20. Were they worried about being outvoted, embarrassed? So what do you think the reason was why they didn't show for any extended amount of time?
And I think that's very much the case. I think, Putin's decision not to be present was probably because he was going to get hit hard on the issue of Ukraine. The last time we had something similar to this was back in 2014 when Putin invaded in Crimea. And at the time, he felt very much embarrassed by the fact that he was sort of put on the sidelines. So I think he just didn't want to go through this again.
Understood. Now, another person who was there was Xi Jinping from China. President Biden obviously attended in person as well, and they had a meeting that I understand ran somewhat long. Can you tell us about that meeting? What came out of that? Anything that surprised you?
Sure. So that meeting took place just before all of the G20 meetings. And it was very important for starting a conversation between these two leaders. It's the first time they've actually met. Biden's been president now for nearly 2 years. Xi Jinping has just sort of taken a third term unprecedented in Chinese history, because normally they're gone after two terms. So this is the first time they've actually met in person. Keep in mind as well that she has not been traveling since the pandemic began. So this was one of a very notable sort of foreign visit for him. In terms of what happens between the two of them, the readouts, it looks like they talked about Taiwan, although there were different interpretations of what that meant. Similarly, they have different positions when it comes to the issue of Ukraine as well. But really, the point that they're actually talking, I think, is notable. And certainly people were watching it because it sort of has maybe had implications for the global economy, soothing any kind of fears and nervousness in the markets.
Yeah, absolutely. So now, in terms of the ending of the meeting and the declaration that was released, what were the major results of that?
Sure. So, of course, G20 is primarily about economic and financial issues. Although, of course, the issue of Ukraine does loom large, and because as I flagged up, it has had repercussions in relation to energy and food. That has meant that they did have to reference it. They didn't achieve what the host of the G20 Summit, the Indonesian president Jokowi, wanted, which was to find a solution to the problem. That wasn't going to happen. Although what they did in the declaration was to just reiterate the points that they've made elsewhere. Now, there is quite a wide range of opinion amongst these countries as to what the reaction should be towards Russia's invasion. But it was a pretty strident, strong message saying that talking about aggression. So in that sense, I think the Western countries very much got their position across there. But they did acknowledge in the declaration that there were different views and different viewpoints relating to the Ukraine issue.
So speaking of that issue, going forward, do you think the G20 will stay the G20, or do you think Russia might be excluded, as happened with the smaller group of nations? Do you expect this to stay intact despite what's happening in Ukraine?
Unlikely. I mean, this is a group of, I think the nature of the G20 is that you are always going to have differences. And I think those are becoming more and more visible. Of course, keep in mind that this isn't a decision-making body as such. I mean, there is no kind of institutions that operate between these summits. It's just an opportunity for leaders to come together and to talk. Of course, there's going to be differences of opinion, but the point is that it is a regular, ongoing process. I don't think it's going to solve problems, but at least the more that you are talking to people, communicating, I think that makes a difference.
Another question for you, Dr. Burton. There was an interesting, some might say awkward exchange between the Chinese president and Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau on the sidelines of the G20. Is that people making a big deal out of nothing, or was there really something unusual about that interaction? Tell us about it.
Yeah, so what happened there was that some of the media in the media pool caught Xi Jinping sort of protesting to Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, that the Canadians were leaking details from the meetings that they were having. Now, I think this is meant to embarrass the Canadians, and there has been some discussion as to whether this was, the Chinese flexing their muscles somewhat and picking on the Canadians because they are the least likely to be able to hit back on this. But I think it's also worth keeping in mind that these sort of things do happen from time to time. If you are going to allow cameras into a meeting where interactions are taking place, it's likely that you are going to pick these kind of things up. This is just, human dynamics, human interactions. I think that's what maybe stands out for people, is that, we're so used to seeing scripted, stated dialogues and statements that when we sort of catch them on the sidelines, it really maybe magnifies things somewhat.
Indeed. Well, Dr. Burton, I want to thank you so much for giving us this recap, sharing your perspective. These developments, economic and otherwise, will continue to unfold in the coming months. So we look forward to having you back to learn more about what is going on in the world, God willing. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.